Are you there? Oh. Chag Sameach, everyone. It is now Shemini Atzeret. Sukkot has just ended, and the next holiday begins, a holiday which is so largely mysterious to us because it is noted in the Torah that it is simply a holiday on its own. It has its own legs, and yet somehow it is connected to Sukkot. It seems like it is an epilogue to Sukkot. It is an Atzeret, just like Shavuot is called by the rabbis Atzeret, meaning it's the end in some way of themes that have been developed through Pesach. Not on the 8th day, but on the 7 times 7th plus 1 day, which is, that is Shavuot. That's the Atzeret of the springtime. But the Atzeret perhaps that brings all of the fall holidays together, Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, or the 8th day on which the convocation is dismissed, remains its own independent holiday. If you want to read a particularly good chapter about Shemini Atzeret, look for Mordechai Kaplan, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Thought. There is a chapter on Shemini Atzeret, which for my money is the best chapter in the book, about God as felt experience. In effect, he says in more modern language what the rabbis said for centuries, which is, we've had enough visitors, we've had enough sacrifices, we've had enough traipsing through the temple, had enough spiritual pilgrims. What we want is a little bit of time together. Can we take one more day and just be together and then go home? So that sentiment is something that Kaplan carries through, as I say, in language that is perhaps a little bit more insistent and modern and in keeping with his way of presenting Judaism. But it is essentially his message for Shemini Atzeret, and definitely a chapter worth looking at if you like that kind of expression. I personally am feeling very enfolded by this Sukkah and by the company and by being a guest of the Grabers, who are such great friends and traveling companions. And Rabbi Graber, Daniel, put in front of me a text just yesterday that he sent me today. You want to say something about that text? Can you make yourself heard, actually? Can you hear me?
Yes.
So if any of you were at the Minyan, we had a Minyan of condolence this week, and I use that term instead of Shiva Minyan because in classical Jewish thought, Shiva is canceled by the onset of the festival. A few years ago, I wrote a tshuva for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement, clarifying that while the mitzvah of Shiva, which is an individual mitzvah, it falls upon the mourner to observe Shiva after one of 7 relatives dies. That is canceled with the onset of a festival. There is a separate mitzvah of nichum abelim, of comforting those who are in mourning. And that is incumbent upon the community, and that still applies. And we even have texts going back 2,000 years to the Tosefta, speaking of someone taking their lulav wherever they went, including to go comfort mourners on Sukkot. And what that tells you is that in classical rabbinic thought, comforting mourners on Sukkot, on a festival, was something that took place. So we had a minyan of condolence. We gathered in order to be of comfort to someone in our community who passed away. we convened the minyan at the synagogue in the Sukkah, and there's a text in the Talmud that asks the following question. It says a mourner is required to sit in the Sukkah, and the rabbis sort of debate this question, and they say, well, wait a minute, if we're sitting in the Sukkah and it starts to rain, the reason that we leave is because it's uncomfortable. And doesn't that mean that if you're uncomfortable, that you should not be in the Sukkah? And a mourner is certainly uncomfortable, is pained in the words of the Talmud. And so shouldn't they, how can a mourner be required to be in the Sukkah? And the answer is given by the Talmud that the mourner should come to the Sukkah and settle themselves. Now, that language classically probably meant something like stop feeling sad and, gird yourself and make yourself happy in the Sukkah. But a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, suggested that word settle yourself is actually the same verb that we use when we say the blessing to sit or to be settled in the Sukkah. And so he suggested that when a mourner sits in the Sukkah, that the Sukkah can be a place of feeling settled, not sort of feeling happy necessarily, but of being permitted to be their full selves. And I'll just say that it was pretty extraordinary. At the end of the minyan, we said the blessing, Le'shev Basukkah. But when we did it right after saying Hamakom Yenachem, and we said the blessing together with the kavanah of hoping that this person could find a sense of being settled in the Sukkah.
I think it's profoundly important, and it connects very much with the poem that I'd like to read, or that we'd like to read. I'd like to read with you by Sivan Harshefi. But first, I think a little bit of the just to extend the time in the Sukkah that we're spending in the Sukkah, and that you by association are spending in the Sukkah with us, just to settle ourselves into the Sukkah. What does it mean to actually have the settledness of spirit, to be in the Sukkah and put in place certain parts of our lives that are not necessarily always in place? So maybe we'll sing for a minute. Sing the 23rd Psalm as Karl Bach envisioned it, and then we'll sing it. We'll sing it in Hebrew, and then Jenna, if you have it on the screen, we'll then look at it in English. Whoa, there it is. We just need to. We need to make it bigger. Here. Oh, you don't have to. Yeah, you'll need to make it a little bit bigger. There, that's better. That's better. Okay. Is molda vilado nairoi lo yar biteni al menenu yenaleni Yancheni b'magid tzedek leman shemo gam ki elech And in English.
O Lord, you are my shepherd, and I your well-kept sheep. You show me grassy pastures, protect me in sleep. Beside the tranquil waters, you nourish my soul. You guide me on the path where you lead your trusting fold. And even when the valley appears as dark as death,
I will fear no harm, for I breathe your very breath. Your shepherd's crook and staff comfort me along the road. You prepare for me a table in the presence of my foes. Get to the bottom.
Jenna, can you scroll down a bit?
They might have it, and I don't. Anyway, want to go on?
No, we have, yes.
Yeah, but
Your shepherd, crook and staff, comfort me
where'er I go. You prepare for me a table in the presence of my foe.
You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. For your goodness and your mercy are
all my
my
spirit knows He's good. So however long I stay, la 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 la.
forever and a day.
Sorry, we
Well,
didn't coordinate as well.
I hope you got the idea and feel a little bit of that. I don't know, healing, holding power of the Sukkah if you settle yourself into it.
Hunter can't get it, maybe? No, she's, Hunter, are you here?
I am, because I went to the Bethel calendar and there was a Zoom link there, but there's no Zoom link with the announcement in the Shabbat reminder.
I
Click,
see.
but
I included a Zoom link in the letter that I sent out today, a couple
Okay,
hours.
I didn't look there. I was looking at the Shabbat reminder.
All right. Well, use that translation and use that melody. Very nice and very, very helpful and very settling, I think. But now we could go from the Gemara that Rabbi Graber sent me and just described to you about what it means to settle yourself in the Sukkah. You might be a mourner, but you might well be settled in the Sukkah. Is there something about the Sukkah that is essentially settling for you? There are all manner of magical, extraordinary things about the Sukkah. It has to be high, but not too high. It has to have sun, but not too much sun. It has to have shade. It has to change during the course of the day. You have to see the reflections or the silhouette of the schach as it shifts and changes across the walls and on the floor. Portraits of a changing God, perhaps. And I took some photographs of God visiting the Sukkah this afternoon as I sat in it for the last time. And I think we'll post those photographs and you'll be able to see what I mean. But not only is God the dependable shade, as the Zohar says it, the dependable presence of shade that outlines the sun, that cuts meaning across what would otherwise be blazing sunlight. But God is also your presence in the Sukkah. The psalmist says, Adonai tzilcha, which can either mean the Lord is your shade that protects you as you ascend the mountain. It's one of the Shir HaMa'alot, one of the pilgrim songs. Adonai tzilcha, God is your shadow, your shade, who protects you as you make the climb. Or else you can read it a different way, the way the Baal Shem read it, which was, God is actually your shadow. And whatever pose you strike in the door, that's God. Whatever actions you commit yourself to carrying forward, that's God. So sitting in the Sukkah, it can't be too high, that can't be too low, that has to have more shade than sun, that has to have the portrait, as it were, of God reflected on the walls and changing on the walls. The Sukkah that captures space, that after you took the Sukkah down, likely from the same spot last year, just became open yard, but now it's enfolded, as are all the memories of all of the guests and all of the things that you've done in the Sukkah over the years. There's a certain amount of magic and imagination to that. And if you settle into that, especially late in the day, late in Sukkot, extraordinary things happen. And maybe Sivan Harshefi had that in mind. I don't know, but she did write an extraordinary poem. And Jenna, if you're with us, maybe you'll put up the poem, put it up large enough so that folks can see it. That's pretty good. Kulam itashkezu b'sukkatcha. All are cared for in your sukkah. Abraham, pained from the Milah covenant. Isaac, weak-eyed. Jacob, limping on his hip. Moses comes, stuttering. Aaron, scorched by fire and struck dumb. Joseph, torn apart by his pit and by his bonds. And David, scarred from his wars with his enemies and with his son. All are cared for in your sukkah. Shall I say that they left whole and healed? She'omar ki yatzeu shelemim uvri'im? Lo, no, they left achirim, different, chasirim, lacking, ach pachot meririm, but less bitter, more forgiving and trusting in your goodness, yoter mevinim, more discerning. They turned their wounds into Torahs and prayers. Hem hafechu et pitzeehem letorot utfilot, v'sipurei ma'asiyot, into legends, into melodies, and more. They left their descendants with them as those coming from their mother's womb, swaddled, washed, and loved. Despite this, and actually because of it. Jenna, the end of the poem is cut off. Can you move it a little bit so that the end of the poem is there? Well, poems are notoriously difficult to take in all at once. Nevertheless, I wonder what caught your eye about this poem and about what it means to say, Kulam it ashpezu besukatcha. Everyone is cared for in your sukkah. Yeah, what do you think, Adina?
Well, I think it's an amazing, you translated it beautiful. It is cared for, but of course it resonates with ushpizin. Everybody is in ushpiz in your sukkah, but in modern Hebrew, le'ashpez and lehitashpez is to be in a hospital. It's the same shoresh, it's the same root. They have been hospitalized to become better, to become cared for, to become healed for. And it's, she has a line here, whether is it, shall I say they left whole and healed? So the purpose of being in ushpiz is to become healed. So there are layers upon layers of that word that are in this poem, and you did a wonderful job with that. But it resonates so much.
Well, thank you. And you lay bare a very important conversation. What does it mean to be healed? The truth is that to be healed means to be made whole. And to be cured means to be cared for. Cure and care are the same word, just like heal and whole are the same word. Can you be cared for? Is that a kind of curing? Can you be cared for in the atmosphere that she creates of the sukkah? And look at the people whom she invites into the sukkah. These are the ushpizin, the mythical, historical, ancestral visitors who come and strengthen us by their presence in the sukkah. The word ushpiz or le'ashpez is actually, if you try to figure out where it comes from, you won't be able to look for the Aramaic or the Persian or anything like that. It's a corruption of the Latin hospice. Ushpizin is a corruption of hospice, which gives us hospital. It is a place to be cared for. Is it a place to be cured? Not always. But what do you think? What do you think of the process that's involved here of lehit ashpez, of being cared for? How do they do it? How does it work? Can you do it? Can anyone do it? How does the Sukkah do it? Rabbi Graber wants to know.
Maybe it has something to do with being gathered together in the sukkah and people caring for one another in the sukkah. She really just says all are cared for in your sukkah. And so somehow being there, they are being cared for. But she doesn't really go into a lot of detail about how and who.
Isn't that interesting? Just by being there, by walking in, or by settling. Leishev basukah is how the bracha ends. To sit, not just to sit, but to be settled. I've often thought that the word yeshiva, which the college, the rabbinical college, or sparring sections where people fight about Gemara passages and hammer out the meaning of sharpening their swords against one another and hammer out the meaning going forward of what this passage means in the next. It's called the yeshiva, but in some ways it seems antithetical to the spirit of what yeshiva should be. It should be something that's more settled and reflective and a little bit more quiet. Why does there have to be all that noise?
So I don't know if you can hear me.
No, I can't hear you. No. Louder.
What I said, what I said is that the Sukkah recalls the time in the desert, which is a place of exile. And Yishuv Haaretz is the settling of the land of Israel. And so it carries with it, I think that the Sukkah itself, you were saying that the yeshiva is a place of battle, right? But it's named yeshiva, a place of settling. And I think the Sukkah carries with it the paradox of being a place of exile that you are supposed to settle. You're supposed to settle into unsettled.
What would you say it means to have a place where you can become less bitter and more forgiving and trusting by becoming more discerning, turning their wounds into Torahs and prayers? What does that mean? Into legends, into melodies. Torahs, prayers, legends, and melodies.
If I may, I was really struck by that phrase of, where is this? Turning their wounds into Torahs and prayers, because I've known some people who've been abused as children, who have gone through difficult divorces, who have had terrible illnesses, and they kind of turned it into a positive thing because they became resolved to help other people in those situations, of using that pain that they had to turn to make sure other people didn't go through the pain, or somehow ease that pain in some way. So to me, this poem kind of talks about every part of you is still welcome. Your wounds, you still have them, but they turn into good things. They turn into blessings to other people in some ways, because it's now a gift to better their lives and to ease their pain and to make their lives better.
I love that, Brad, that every part of them is still welcome. And the still means that we might have had some prejudices against them, or we might have bet against them getting better. But if the Sukkah offers them a place, quiet, contemplative, sacred space where magical things can happen, where things of the spirit can happen that you can't really and don't need to translate in a linear fashion, then perhaps the experiences become Torahs and legends and melodies.
The
I think that the brokenness of the Sukkah is precisely what allows that to take place.
And I'm just struck by it saying all are cared for, kulam. So it's not maybe just one person with all of their brokenness and pain and disruption, but all of that person is cared for. There's space to receive. That becomes a tremendous healing process, can create a tremendous healing process.
Yeah. Adina.
I find it very interesting that the word is, it's a reflexive verb. They themselves intentionally came to this place that becomes transformative. They all are aware of their wounds and their brokenness. Each one of them has a brokenness, and what is described, they have many wonderful attributes, each one of them. But what she describes in here is their brokenness. And they intentionally come and are becoming, to a degree, transformed, to a degree not. They stay with the brokenness, but to the degree they create stories and legends and nigunim, and they come to this place of healing intentionally. I think there's an intentionality there, and a transformational quality to the sukkah. Beautiful.
Yeah, sorry, Roger. And then Jean.
I agree, but I had already put in my part about that. I guess what allows that brokenness to be transformed and is cared for as well as it's not and their humanity is cared for. So like, it's an old story how physicians can talk about healing. I healed that cancer in room 222, but this is a different kind of healing where it's the whole person that's being cared for with the cancer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jean.
I find it's not coincidental that the holiday follows Yom Kippur fairly closely. It seems to me, based on the poem and just experience, that it's almost a place of the final redemption after the holiday of Yom Kippur, and talking about all the healing where your heart has been broken and needs to be put back together. And I find it also, the other day when I walked into the Sukkah on Shabbat, it wasn't really something I felt, but there's a presence in great depth, but there's a presence in being in the Sukkah. It's a bet, isn't it? It's shaped like a bet, like a house, but it's an incomplete house with a side open. And so you're open to what is outside, and yet you're inside. And it's just like a magical place of healing and final redemption to me. That's what I saw.
Yeah. Yeah. Bernie.
I find it interesting that in the first half of the poem, there are all these male characters. Okay. But then the poem ends with support from the mother, swaddled, washed, and loved. Like the Sukkah is that feminine aspect that's providing that swaddling, washed, and loved.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that attention to bear also. And it's quite reasonable for us to take 7 women. Ruchama Weiss, I think it is, who wrote Imahot B'Tipul, Mothers in Therapy, which is about the matriarchs, but of course it's not about, it's about everybody. And that's, it would be very interesting to take 7 women and say, well, what would bring them, Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah and Deborah and so on. 7, Miriam, what would bring them to the Sukkah? And what kinds of legends spin from their adventures or from their traumas and so on. That's really important. And we need that. Yeah, Sarah and then Debbie.
So my experience of being in the sukkah is a protection and a certain kind of containment. It's a paradox because, you know, we've talked about how the space is delimited in very certain ways and of a limited size. And yet, to me, when I walk into the sukkah, it's like walking into a space, an infinite space. It has infinite depth. It has infinite height. And yet I feel contained and held in that space. There's some very unusual mix of the holy and the daily, because we are supposed to be living, even for those of us who don't actually live our lives and sleep and eat all our meals in the sukkah. There is that mix of the dailiness of the activities that we are told to participate in, and yet the holiness of the space that is created with that intention and with those dimensional qualities.
Yeah, dimensions without dimensionality, unmeasurable measuredness. Yeah, this is the liminality of the Sukkah. Thank you, Debbie.
I still like to call this poem In the Care of the Sukkah, because that says more to me than to say all are cared for. So if you walk into the sukkah, you are in the care of the sukkah and all that means. But what it says to me is that if I can learn from the dysfunction of body, mind, and soul from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, who did I leave out? David, then I can become wise and learn how to find God's goodness. And that's the problem, isn't it? Finding God's goodness. Then I can heal from my brokenness.
I think the thing that I appreciated about this is that, you know, the last two lines, despite this and actually because of it. So being cured or being made whole is not an erasure of the experience. It is not to make it as though it had never been. It is to transform it and put it in the service of, and put us in the allow us to be whole enough to carry it and hold it and turn it into something else.
Yes. Thank you.
So I kind of wanted to play Gilda Radner here, who would say, what's all this about healing and caring? I thought the Sukkah was a place for rejoicing, and that this holiday was about rejoicing after all the hard work that we did from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur. And now's the time to just let go a little bit. So with that in mind and reading this, it seems like maybe we're supposed to rejoice, but also remember that things just aren't perfect and we still have work to do. Don't get too cocky about anything, because there's still work that we need to do for ourselves, for our community, taking care of each other. Don't forget that lesson. This seems to be saying to me. But I was surprised when I read it that it had such a somber tone to it, when I was expecting the Sukkah to be this place of hospitality and joy and, you know, food and harvest and fullness and abundance. And, you know, this is giving me a whole other side of it. So I just wanted to say that that's, you know, I'm trying to deal with that as I read it, but I think it does mean there's a lot to remember, a lot to think about.
It seems as though the Torah's prayers, legends, and melodies that they create will now become, or that they create is in their self-knowing and in their caring, and in the attention paid to them by the Sukkah, Debbie, and by those who might inhabit the Sukkah at the same time, share the Sukkah with them, that those Torah's prayers, legends, and melodies become inborn. They become part of the legacy of their descendants, who are born with the Torahs and the prayers and the legends and the melodies, but not necessarily with the sense of brokenness or the struggle that the ancestors lived with. Did I cut somebody off? Sarah? I wasn't sure whether that was your hand or not. You see what I mean? And more, they left and their descendants with them. As those coming from their mother's womb, swaddled, washed, and loved. Despite this, v'dafka mishum kach, and actually because of it. Because of these things that are, because of these events, these traumas, these activities that are processed in the Sukkah, that the Torahs come and the prayers come and the legends come and the melodies come. It's as though the Sukkah is this great Beit Midrash within which everything remains itself, but also becomes symbolic and also becomes the metaphor and reaches beyond itself. What an extraordinary environment to create. What an extraordinary environment of which to be a part. Maybe it's something to take into the Sukkah. I understand that tomorrow is Shemini Atzeret, no longer Sukkot, but if you still have access to a Sukkah, maybe it's the right thing to do to take this poem into the Sukkah and take yourself along with it and think about is there a Torah, a prayer, a legend, or a melody that has come to me from this year's experience? It's another way of getting at the resume of the year, isn't it? It's not a Yom Kippur way, and it's very different, but how lovely and effective, I think. What do you think? Could you do it alone in the Sukkah, or even not alone in the Sukkah with this poem?
I think I need of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Joseph, and David to do that.
You think you need them to do it?
I would need their help.
You would.
Yes.
I want Rabbi Sager's help.
There,
I'd like to know
that works.
I'd like to know what experience you brought into the Sukkah this year and what Torah it became. I mean, since we have him here, we might as well ask, right?
Well, it's one of the nice things of having a colleague who is a good friend. I don't really mind, nor does he mind. We don't mind putting each other on the spot in that kind of way. But I will tell you about a fantasy that has come during Sukkot, and it's the fantasy of being the Magbiah, of being the one who raises the Torah. And of course, Debbie, I have Robert in mind every time I think about anybody raising the Torah. But to raise the Torah, say, "V'zot haTorah asher sam Moshe b'fnei b'nei Yisrael pi Adonai b'yad Moshe." This is the Torah that God spoke, that God put into the world by virtue of divine words and Moses' hand. And to turn it this way and that way so that everybody can see the script. And part of the fantasy is that, first of all, that I can do it when at the moment I don't have the upper body strength to do that. But never mind, because in my fantasy, everything is light. and or not light, but at least it doesn't have any physical weight to it. And I lift the Torah high enough so that the sleeves of my robe come down over my arms, and I'm not wearing a shirt under the robe. Remember, this was a dream, so I'm not wearing it. I'm just wearing the robe, and the sleeves come down to my elbows. And you can't see them now because they're not really there. They have disappeared, but they will reappear again. The purple ink stains, the purple stains on my arms that come because I take a blood thinner. And because if I bang my arm, or if I were Khalila to fall or scrape my arm or something, it doesn't take much. It used to be that it was the kind of thing that I wouldn't even attend to. It wouldn't show up, or it wouldn't be a big deal. You slap a Band-Aid on it. But no, these things require attention. So my fantasy, the sleeves go up and the black ink on the white parchment becomes the purple ink on my arms, which Rivka Miriam tells me are like parchment, because the goldenness of the skin has faded, has darkened, she says. And the Torah has appeared, the Maaseh Bereshit have appeared on my arm. So my arms become the Torah, as it were. And here I am holding up the Torah, and I'm saying V'zot HaTorah, and really what I mean is Ve'elu HaTorot, or something like that. These are the Torahs. This is the Torah of Moses. I'm holding the bottom of the wooden spindle, but below that is the Torah of my arms, which is to say the living experience. And I say then, thank heavens for the arms, because without the arms, that's the living experience. Without the arms, the Torah doesn't get raised. It doesn't get understood. It doesn't get parsed. We don't get a chance to show it to each other on high. So there are these two Torot that are happening on two different kinds of parchment, but they're joined. And V'zot HaTorah means both the written Torah on the parchment and the oral Torah, as it were, or the ever-changing Torah that's written on my arms. And you know what? The truth is that when I'm in the Sukkah and that occurs to me, I'm proud of it. And it becomes a legend. It does not become something, it is not something over which to mourn. It's something over which to rejoice, or at least to tend to. I might wish for a circumstance whereby I didn't have to take a blood thinner. But even so, that doesn't mean that there can't be some kind of Torah or legend or song or melody or prayer that comes from it, because I really think there can. So I don't know. How did I do? Well, yeah, taking maybe not weak eyes or a limp in the hip, but stained arms. And less bitterness about that. Yeah, the legend in some ways bleaches away the bitterness. Any bitterness that might come. Oh no, I now look like, my arms look like, I don't know, my grandfather's, or they look like a bunch of people whom I've seen before. And they've been signs of something that I didn't like and didn't want and never imagined for myself. But guess what? Now they're mine, and that makes a difference. So is it possible that in the Sukkah, or in a Sukkah environment, that an experience gets turned and made into something else, that a different aspect of it comes out? Well, what do you think?
I think it means you've been touched by the world and you're not pure as the driven snow the way the babies are when they come out of their mother's womb. Now you know.
Touched by the world and not like an infant who's full of a certain kind of promise, but
Yeah.
isn't.
She says that you are. You know, the poet here, Debbie, says that the Sukkah gives you the capacity to actually be like that infant. Because the perspective, you're given the gift of perspective to say, all of the judgments that I was making about what I thought were wounds or deficiencies, I can let go of those.
Yeah.
And Adina gave me a thumbs up when I said that, so I feel pretty good.
Right.
Do you want to say more, Adina? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah. I think it's that juxtaposition, both of them, the tension between both. But I think in what helps us become new, like a newborn, is also, she doesn't say it fully, but it seems to me that each one of the people she mentions after Abram have already had other ushpizin that have taught them how to do that. And Steve is teaching us now how to do it. And there's a chance to become renewed like a newborn each time, even though we have our wounds and our traumas and in the Sukkah. So it is learning from the past generations and from our rabbis and our teachers, and becoming and have a chance of not a blank slate because the wounds stay, but there's a newness and like swaddled by like a newborn. So it's an amazing juxtaposition. Thank you, Rabbi Gerber.
Yeah. And thank you, Debbie. What else? Do you think that this is a poem to tuck into your machzor, into your Sukkot prayer book?
I think it's a poem I need to read every other day.
I hope you do. And I hope that if you do, or with whatever frequency you read it, whatever notes, whatever journal notes you make, if they're shareable, that you will share them. I hope that with everybody. Oh, yeah, there. I see them on the back. I see them on the flip side.
Can I ask a question for everybody? And Adina, I'm going to point you to this specifically just because of your Hebrew. At the end, this line, Hem Yatsu V'Tze'etzehem Imam, Kayotze Merechem Imam, right? But it's the same word, but punctuated differently.
No.
With them and their mothers.
Right.
I mean, if you don't pronounce your guttural ayin, right? Then if you're Ashkenaz, then they sound the same. And I'm just curious what you think she's doing there besides just rhyming. Is she trying to say something?
I am not sure that she's saying anything else besides that they're very common words. But obviously she plays with the rhyme, but I'm trying to look at, it's not necessarily a poem with rhymes.
Right.
It's
Sometimes
not-
a rhyme is just a rhyme. But,
Yeah. Yeah, no, but it's not that it is a poem that is structured in a way that has rhymes. It's not. But clearly the imam is powerful. Yeah. Of course, when you read it, you see the distinction immediately. When you hear it, and poetry you both read and hear, but if you read it, it disappeared. The similarity almost disappears. I think.
One of you read it in Hebrew for us?
What?
Can one of you read it in Hebrew? Either Steve, Daniel?
The whole thing? Sure.
Yeah.
Would you, Adina?
Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
You. Okay. Well, okay. אברהם דבוי הברית, ויצחק כהה עיניים, ויעקב צולע על ירחו. משה בא מגמגם, אהרון כבוי אש ואילם, יוסף מטורף משנות בורו ואסוריו, ודוד מצולק ממלחמותיו באויביו ובבנו. כולם התאשפזו בסוכתך. שאומר שיצאו שלמים ובריאים? לא, הם יצאו אחרים, חסרים, אך פחות מרירים, יותר סלחנים, ומאמינים בטובך, יותר מבינים. הם הפכו את פצעיהם לתורות ותפילות, לסיפורי מעשיות, לניגונים ועוד. הם יצאו וצאצאיהם עמם, כיוצא מרחם עמם, עטופים, רחוצים ואהובים, למרות זאת, ודווקא משום כך.
One other note, there's one line, which is the title line, Kulam hitashpu b'sukatcha, which makes the whole poem a prayer, right? In other words, everybody is hosted or cared for in your sukkah. It takes the beginning of the prayer and the beginning of the poem and the end of the poem as speaking to God.
When I read it, I realized there was one other, I had not noticed it before, and also there is a ma'aminim betuvcha. This is a conversation with God. I had not noticed it before. You're right. It is,
Yes.
it's talking to God.
Yeah. Trusting in your goodness. Yes. Yeah, a very important idea, understated in the poem, which makes it more important once we discover it. That the sukkah, regardless of where it is, functions in the same way. And each of those sukkot is a sukkah of God, filled with a community of human beings, represented, of course, most traditionally by these 7. But for us, we have the wide open opportunity to invite the ushpizin whom we would like to invite, including those in our own family, maybe even in a recent circle of loss, one for each day, and allow them the opportunity to unwind their difficulties and their troubles. It may be, you would say, well, I don't know what to say. I'm cowed by this person or that one. I don't know what to say. Maybe you don't have to say anything. Maybe our obligation is to be quiet and to do our own work in the sukkah and to allow the space for someone else to do her work or his work and to be in the space. Maybe that's it. In any event, I think we might pick up, certainly we're not finished with Sukkot, even though the holiday is done. There's more to say about Sukkot and more texts and more poems for us to read about the holiday. And I think we shall do that. But for now, we'll make an end to the conversation. And I hope that you find this poem helpful and that during Shemini Atzeret, whether you have a Sukkah at hand tomorrow or not, that you will put yourself in the Sukkah under the schach, as it were, of this poem, and let it influence you. If you have notes from every second day, Debbie and others, then maybe you'll share them. I think we're all in need of them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Hi, Samaya, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.